Hey guys, today I want to talk about a super powerful solo build, at least on Warlocks. The main goal of this build is to be able to do solo dungeons both safely, but also relatively quickly. It is a prismatic build, so as with any of those, there are a couple of variations you can make, but we're going to talk about that and how you can turn it into your own specialized build for whatever activity you're doing. So let's go ahead and get into it. So starting off with the build, we'll look at the super, and there are two main things to consider when looking at the super. The first one is obviously the effectiveness of the super and what purpose it fills. On Warlock, there are three super good supers right now. You've got Song of Flame, you've got Nova Bomb, and you've got Needlestorm, and they accomplish different various things. Song of Flame is by far the safest option, and it is also a direct upgrade to Well of Radiance when it comes to solo content. Remember that Song of Flame does give you Radiant the user while you have it active, and effective invincibility with the 90% damage resistance that you have as well. But if you are using it on a team, it's important to remember that you'll have to get your teammates Radiant some other way, or use something like Lumina to give them that effect to get them a global buff. As for the other two options we have are Nova Bomb and Needlestorm. And to sum it up very simply, Nova Bomb does the most damage out of all of the damage supers in the game right now. However, Needlestorm is not too far behind, and it has the advantage of having a better effect for Facet of Purpose, which is the other big thing you're looking at when you're deciding your super. Facet of Purpose gives you a different healing verb whenever you pick up orbs based on what super you have equipped. So if you have Solar on, you get Restoration, and if you have Strand on, then you get Woven Mail. And that is the big downside with Nova Bomb, is that you unfortunately get Void Overshield, which is a very weak healing verb when compared to the other ones in PvE. That said, if you're doing one of the easier dungeons, or you're not really having any problems with your survivability on a given encounter, I definitely recommend running Nova Bomb, as it is the most powerful. But if you're looking for that balance between survivability and having a powerful damage super, look no further than Needlestorm. But if you're somebody who wants maximum safety, you get pretty much the best healing verb and a very safe super that can be a great panic button in the form of Song of Flame. Next up, let's talk about the aspects, and this is a pretty straightforward setup here. We're going to be using Feed the Void, obviously, with either the turrets or Hellion. I recommend the turrets for the most part, but there are some specific use cases where you might want to use Hellion instead. The turrets are pretty helpful when you're solo because you are expected to do the activity that three people are meant to do, so basically it can just freeze stuff while you're not looking at it, and then once you get over to it, you can kill it. Another very useful effect of the turret is since the freeze shatters count as ability damage, you can actually get Devour off of shattering your frozen enemies as long as the shatter damage is what kills them or enemies around them. This means that you can even freeze an enemy and leave them there and then pop them whenever you need a quick heal with Devour. Hellion, on the other hand, is a very easy way to clear out ads without using any of your weapons, and this is great for helping you to generate ammo because you can basically hold your heavy or your special and generate ammo for the one that you're looking for, because for the most part in solo, you're using very specialized loadouts that are likely going to consist of double special. Hellion also has the benefit of adding Scorch to any weapons whose damage is based on ignitions, such as Dragon's Breath or the Caster Polaris Frame Sword. Moving on to the grenades and melees, there is a pretty simple setup here. I recommend using either the Void Grenade or the Arc Grenade. That said, your choice also somewhat depends on your exotic. If you're going to be using a Star Eater's class item, you could just use the Void one just fine, although I do highly recommend using the Arc one as well, because you're able to get Amplified, which currently gives you a 30% damage resistance whenever it's active on the artifact that we have this season. This is even more powerful if you're going to be using the Getaway Artists instead of a Star Eater's class item. While this is going to reduce your damage output, it's going to make your neutral game quite a bit stronger. Being able to get Amplified on demand and also have the little buddy that can proc Devour for you can be very helpful in staying alive. We'll talk more about exotics after we get through the base build. As for the melee, you are pretty much always going to be using Arcane Needle. We're mixing this with one of the fragments that we'll talk about in a little bit to basically just have very good Radiant uptime, which is super important in a solo setting because you have to apply all the buffs and debuffs yourself and you don't have anybody that can help you. You don't have a teammate dropping a well for you or shooting you with Lumina or anything like that. So it is very nice to be able to get Radiant all on your own, and the Arcane Needle is by far the best way to do that. In addition to that, the Arcane Needle also adds Unraveling to the enemy, which is just a little bit of extra DOT damage for completely free. And lastly, we'll talk about the fragments. The first one in my lineup is the Facet of Dominance. This basically just makes your Void Grenades weaken and your Arc Grenades jolt. This means that your Transcendent Grenades are going to weaken bosses, which is super helpful. It also lets you spam your melees while you're Transcendent, so you can basically just do a melee and a grenade and then start dumping ammo for 5 seconds and repeat the process. The abilities pad out and increase your total damage, and you get the damage buff and the debuff applied to your weapon damage, which is super nice. And don't forget, if you're using a Void weapon for damage, to use the Expanding Abyss mod on your artifact this season. Next up in my lineup is Facet of Ruin. Basically, this is just so that the shattering is even better on the turret stuff. However, it is also nice for Hellion if you're doing ignition-based damage. Next up we have Facet of Dawn. This is how we're getting Radiant using our melee, and it is a super nice combination with Arcane Needle since you get to have 3 stacks, and using Transcendent you'll be able to spam them very easily. Next up is Facet of Protection. This is going to be in nearly every prismatic build ever made in the history of the world. It is so helpful. Whenever you're surrounded, you get damage resistance, which is absolutely amazing. Being surrounded is pretty much when you're at your most vulnerable, so being able to have extra damage resistance just in those situations is pretty much just having extra damage resistance anytime it's remotely useful. And finally, we have Facet of Purpose. Even if you are using Nova Bomb, I still recommend this. However, if you are using Nova Bomb, this is probably the most flexible one that you can swap out. That being said, it is very nice being able to get some healing off of orbs. You can make orbs all the time, especially if you're using something like the Risk Runner's Sword right now. It is super powerful and makes a ton of orbs. But there's a lot of ways to generate orbs, and you could even plan out orbs throughout your DPS phase, which can also give you Radiant with the current artifact. Orbs are super powerful now, and I highly recommend running Facet of Purpose just for that healing. It helps with your neutral game and can even keep you alive in something like a damage phase if you have orbs laying around. So that's pretty much the base build, but now let's talk about some of the exotics that you can use with it. First of all, for a non-class item version, I highly recommend using the Getaway Artists. I don't really like Getaway Artists in any activity where I have teammates, but solo it is actually pretty good. I feel like with teammates they are constantly stealing the kills that it's getting, which kind of gets rid of the purpose it has. The grenade regen isn't really that good just on hits, so I don't think it's a huge deal to have it, but it definitely doesn't hurt. But where it really shines is just being another way to proc Devour because it counts as ability damage, and when you're solo you will always get the kills as long as you are setting yourself up to do it. There's nobody there to steal them from you. Moving on from that, we have the class items, and there are actually quite a few really good options for the exotic class item when it comes to Prismatic here on Warlock. The first and obvious one is going to be Star Eaters. This is pretty much just the best anytime you're using something that isn't Song of Flame. If you are using Song of Flame, I don't really see the need to do this because Song of Flame isn't meant to be for damage. It's more so just to be very good Radiant uptime and survivability, and you're better off not using the abilities so that you just have better uptime on it anyway. That being said, if you're using Needlestorm or Nova Bomb, I would highly recommend using the Star Eaters because it is a 70% increase to that damage, and they already have a sizable base damage. As for the pairing with Star Eaters, I would recommend using Necrotic Grips probably. Necrotic is super nice just as an extra way to clear out ads. A lot of the ads are weak enough to just be one-shotted by Arcane Needle, and if that's the case, you will proc Devour off of that, and then you will be able to have the poison spread and keep killing things. And because it kills things kind of gradually and on a delay, the Devour is constantly proccing over and over, and you can do that while you're taking heavy damage to stay alive pretty consistently. In addition to that, if it doesn't kill things, it will almost always unravel and then kill the target with poison, which will then turn them into a Tangle, and you can kill enemies with a Tangle to proc Devour as well, so you get a lot of options there. While that might be the main exotic class item I'd want to use, there are a couple of extra utility ones that can be kind of nice. Apotheosis definitely has some benefits, but I think it's mostly specialized to doing stuff like Euphony, which isn't very good in a lot of dungeons, especially in solo setups. Euphony is pretty much specialized just for the Witness, and there's not a lot of situations where it shines otherwise. Since you're just going to be using Transcendent to throw a bunch of Void Grenades anyways, I really don't see the big use behind using something like Apotheosis just to throw a bunch of regular Void Grenades. It is kind of like 5 extra seconds of being kind of Transcendent because you get the ability regen, but overall I don't think it's worth taking up the slot when there are some other super powerful things in there, things like Necrotic Grips. But if you wanted to do a swap for DPS, that is definitely an option. Another nice one is to have a Spirit of Harmony laying around. This lets you get more super energy back whenever your weapon kills match your super's element. And this is great if you panic pop your super for survivability like I did in the background here, or if you are just using your super often and you're in a phase that has multiple sub-phases, something like Heffend, where you want to super each floor. Harmony is great at getting you a super for every one of those floors, whereas you might not be able to get it without. That being said, there's still other better main character options, but this is a great utility to keep in mind in certain situations. And lastly, we'll talk about some of the better solo DPS weapons that there are right now. Especially on Warlock, the meta isn't super defined right now, mostly everybody's just like her still hunt, and so there's actually a decent variety when it comes to Warlock depending on the situation you're in. As a default go-to, I like to use the Arc Conductor Sword, ergo Sum, mixed with a Lost Signal, and then Edge Transit in the heavy slot. I think this is a great go-to setup, however it does have the issue of not being able to shoot objectives, so this can cause problems if you're trying to like shoot the balls on the later encounters of Warlord's Ruin, but if you don't have any objectives that you need to shoot like that, this is a great setup. Otherwise you could switch the Lost Signal over to like a Trace Rifle or something like that if you wanted to. And then you have the Arc Conductor Sword for super good survivability and ag clear, as well as charging your Transcendence very quickly, which can be helpful for those multi-phase damage phases. Edge Transit is still kind of a goat when it comes to solo damage. You could go the Envious and Bait and Switch route if you want to have an easy and still effective way of doing damage. Unfortunately, we don't have any great reload verbs, so it's kind of difficult to run Cascade and Bait and Switch right now. However, if you are running something that does have good reloads, like if you are playing Hunter and still watching this video, or you're on Solar Warlock and you're just using Rain of Fire, it's definitely a great weapon to use with Bait and Switch Cascade Point combined. Some other good weapons are still the remainders that we had from the last season, stuff like Sunshot for clearing ads. Cloud Strike has also risen up the ranks in DPS, so Cloud Strike is a great option as well for any boss that you can hit crits on. Still Hunt is decent, however Cloud Strike actually has higher damage numbers for sustained damage than Still Hunt, so unless the damage phase is super short, I would recommend just using Cloud Strike over Still Hunt most of the time. For the most part, what you're looking for in these weapons is very reliable damage, but also high damage and easy to use perks. Bait and Switch is a great example, Explosive Light can be very helpful as well, and Surrounded if you're in the right kind of dungeons, especially the newer ones, can be very easy to proc without even thinking about it. Anyway, that is going to do it for the video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye!